Hi, my name is Rose, and today I'm going to be presenting a portion of my undergraduate honors thesis on Mary Colter and Hopi architecture at the Grand Canyon. This project looks at how Native American culture is represented at Grand Canyon National Park through the architecture of Mary Colter and how the systems continue to shape relations between the park, the Hopi tribe, and tourists today. The Grand Canyon was established as a national park in 1919, but it had been a popular tourist destination for nearly 20 years at that point. The Fred Harvey Company, a big name in hospitality at the time, began establishing infrastructure there as early as 1901. Mary Colter was an interior decorator and architectural designer for the Fred Harvey Company for nearly 50 years. During her tenure, she designed 6 of the most recognizable visitor buildings on the South Rim: Hopi House, Lookout Studio, Hermit's Rest, Phantom Ranch, Desert View Watchtower, and Bright Angel Lodge. I will be looking at all of these during my project except for Phantom Ranch, which is a lodge deep within the canyon and only accessible for those who are participating on overnight hikes across the canyon. Colter's work draws on indigenous Southwestern architectural traditions, using native materials and aiming to integrate buildings into the landscape. Her work deeply shaped the visual identity of the park, shaping how visitors experience and interpret the space today. When I visited the park for the first time in 2022, I began to wonder about this. How has Mary Colter affected how Native culture is presented today? Who controls Native representation at the park? Who constructed the version of Native culture we see today? To answer this, I looked to Gayatri Spivak's interpretations of Darstellung and Vertretung, 2 German words for representation with different connotations. Spivak uses Vertretung to describe how the dominant culture often speaks for marginalized groups rather than allowing them to represent themselves. On the screen, I'm showing an early scene from Hopi House, when Hopi artists were encouraged to show traditional lifestyles and art forms for visiting tourists. This ties into tourism theorist Dean McCannell's concept of staged authenticity, which describes how tourist spaces often construct curated scenes that appear authentic but are in fact carefully arranged for public consumption. For the summer of 2025, I was honored with the opportunity to create my own research fellowship by the Center for Undergraduate Research and Engagement with the SURF Award. I planned my trip for August, scheduling interviews with several members of National Park Service and organizing trips to see rare materials. Unfortunately, the Dragon Bravo fire at the North Rim caused the park to be smoked out and brought into a drought, causing me to delay my trip until October. Rescheduling everything was fine until the government shutdown made nearly all of the National Park services I had planned to utilize during my trip shut down until further notice. I decided to go through with my trip and take advantage of the unique circumstances. While there were no park rangers or other government employees for me to talk to, there were hospitality workers and retail employees. While I couldn't access the rare materials at the Grand Canyon National Park Library anymore, I could use the gift stores I was studying as my primary field sites, taking note of their inventories and how they presented themselves to the visitors. Hopi House was Colter's first building at the Grand Canyon. Modeled directly after Hopi architecture, Hopi House was designed with the idea that indigenous artists would live and work on site, allowing tourists to observe production directly. However, those who lived there were encouraged to wear traditional costuming and perform menial domestic tasks regardless of their own lifestyles, presenting an image of their culture that highlighted their artistic prowess while also reinforcing ideas of primitivity and otherness. Today, Hopi House continues to operate as a gift store, though employees no longer have to use the upper stories as living quarters. However, the space continues to be immersive, with low ceilings and densely packed tables full of indigenous art. The store is managed by a Hopi woman whose family has been employed by GCNP for several generations, and several of the artists featured in Hopi House are themselves descendants of previous artists and residents. Hopi House has moved away from staging authenticity, instead focusing on its own history as a gift store and providing a space for Indigenous art to reach wider audiences. Lookout Studio and Hermit's Rest both use native materials and Hopi masonry techniques as well, but without direct imitation. Instead, Colter focused on blending these buildings into their surroundings. These buildings embed Indigenous aesthetics into the park without direct connections to Indigenous culture. They have their own histories that Colter made up for them as well, but they are unrelated to Native cultures. Bright Angel Lodge was primarily built to match existing log cabin lodging and only has small touches of Indigenous aesthetics. However, several cabins do playfully combine log cabin construction with Indigenous adobe construction, such as the one that I show here. Desert View Watchtower, one of Colter's last constructions, was also inspired by Indigenous architecture, though heavily altered. Designed as a concession for Native art and souvenirs, Colter invented a fake history for the building describing its importance in Indigenous culture. An entirely fabricated blessing ceremony was performed during the grand opening of the building, an act that ended up quite controversial, with many Hopi tribe members protesting the insensitive, inaccurate, and sensationalized version of their sacred rituals. Today, the tower is presented in a significantly different way. Nearly all of the retail activity has shifted to the nearby Desert View Trading Post, leaving the interior of the tower to be presented as a now authentically historic piece of art. The architectural forms that Colter learned from Indigenous builders have been utilized and reimagined, with trailing masonry and spiraling log ceilings throughout the space. Fred Cabote, a famous Hopi artist who created the murals covering the interior of the tower, still has family that visit Desert View Watchtower often and maintain close connections with the staff there. There are a dozen retail environments within the park that continued to be open during the government shutdown. These are managed by independent hospitality companies Xanterra, Delaware North, and Grand Canyon Conservancy. Colter's 6 buildings make up half of these, although the Desert View Trading Post exists primarily as an extension of the watchtower. While I had initially only focused on Colter's buildings, I decided to visit all of these stores in order to test a hypothesis I had about the presence of Native art within these spaces. Primary retailers of Native art at the Grand Canyon were Hopi House and Desert View Watchtower, though Hermit's Rest did include a few mass-produced items that were identified as Native-made. These items ranged from jewelry, pottery, paintings, dolls, and other craft work. However, there was also a significant amount of what I'm calling imitation Native art, which clearly invoked the aesthetics and crafting style of Native artwork, but was clearly labeled as non-Native made. These were found in nearly all of the non-Colter stores, though that does include the Trading Post. There were also a few items at the Bright Angel gift shop and Hermit's Rest. These items seem to all be mass-produced, ranging from jewelry featuring Native motifs to recreations of legitimate Native pottery. Native art was always clearly labeled as such, though the labels varied in detail from item to item. These are just a few of the pictures of art that I took while I was there. Of all of the stores, Hopi House certainly had the most labeling. In Hopi House, there were many labels that included not only a biography of the artist, but also cultural context for the art forms themselves. These were printed out en masse to allow guests to take them home with their purchases. In turn, imitation Native art was also always clearly labeled, though to varying degrees of clarity. While some items had big signs confirming their non-Native status, some items, such as those, "Look, Southwest jewelry earrings," only had tiny writing on the back identifying them as not Indian-made. Mary Colter's work still structures the visual and spatial language of the Grand Canyon's visitor experience. Her buildings established design vocabulary for the park that is now used throughout the park. While Hopi House and Desert View Watchtower were initially intended to imitate Indigenous architecture, they have existed long enough to celebrate their own histories instead, with their own layered meanings and complicated pasts. Colter's goal was always to bring Indigenous culture into the park and share with tourists. During a time when Native peoples were widely misrepresented as dangerous and uncultured, if they were represented at all. They were excluded from Euro-American culture, and legislation was actively working to remove them from their ancestral lands and erase their cultural histories. Although her methods were not always morally sound by today's standards, her original goal of Indigenous involvement is now being reworked through the ongoing collaboration between Grand Canyon National Park, Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, and the Indigenous artists and workers who are beginning to have a say in how these spaces are used and understood. I wanted to acknowledge the employees of Bright Angel Lodge, Desert View Trading Post, and Hopi House who were kind enough to talk to me during this project, as well as the Grand Canyon Conservancy, Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, the Center of Undergraduate Research and Engagement, my advisor, Emily Eliza Scott, my partner, Matthew, who went on the trip with me, and the nice man who took this photograph for us. Here are the images that I used by slide. And here is my long and all-inclusive bibliography for my whole project. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.